It was one of those long, languid summer evenings where the world seemed to slow down just enough to remind you of everything you've been avoiding. The air was warm and heavy, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and honeysuckle from the neighbor's yard. I sat on the porch barefoot, with a glass of iced tea sweating against my palm. The house behind me was quiet, too quiet. Ryan had been inside all day, probably glued to his laptop or phone like most kids his age. Not that he was a kid anymore. He'd turned 18 a few months back, tall and lean now, with a confidence, or maybe restlessness, that hadn't been there before. I stretched my legs out, letting the rough wood of the porch press against my calves, and tried to lose myself in the rhythm of the cicadas. It was peaceful in a way, but there was this nagging edge to it, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum. I'd been feeling it more and more lately. Maybe it was the strain of raising Ryan alone, though it wasn't like I hadn't adjusted to being a single parent. His dad, my ex-husband, had walked out 2 years ago, leaving a void I'd worked hard to fill. I'd done everything I could to make sure Ryan had what he needed, emotionally and otherwise, but there was only so much one person could do. The crunch of gravel startled me, and I turned to see Ryan stepping out from the shadows of the driveway. He wasn't wearing shoes either, just basketball shorts and a loose t-shirt. His hair was messy, like he'd been lying in bed for hours and finally decided to move. "Hey," he said, hands stuffed in his pockets. "What are you doing out here?" "Just enjoying the quiet," I replied, forcing a lightness into my voice. "What about you? Thought you were camped out in your room for the night." He shrugged and came closer, sitting down on the edge of the porch, a good couple of feet away from me. He stretched his legs out too, mirroring my posture, and stared out at the empty street. "Couldn't sleep," he said finally. "Felt like, I don't know. Thought some fresh air might help." I nodded, not pushing. Ryan had always been a bit of a closed book, especially since the divorce. I learned a long time ago that prying only made him clam up more. Instead, I took another sip of my tea and waited. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet, almost like he wasn't sure he wanted me to hear. The question caught me off guard. "What, the house?" "Yeah, the neighborhood, the state, I don't know." I glanced at him, but his gaze stayed fixed on the dark horizon. There was something in his tone, not quite sadness, not quite frustration, that tugged at me. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But this is home, at least for now. Why, you feeling restless?" He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Something like that." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched between us, not awkward exactly, but thick with something unspoken. I couldn't tell if it was his mood affecting me or my own thoughts spiraling again. I found myself looking at him, really looking at him. His profile was sharper than I remembered, the curve of his jaw more defined. He wasn't the little boy I'd taken to baseball practice anymore. I shook the thought away, guilt prickling at the edges of my mind. "You know," I said, trying to steer the conversation somewhere lighter, "summer always feels like this, lazy and aimless. But you'll be off to college soon and things will change. You might even miss these quiet nights." He turned to me then, his eyes catching the faint glow of the porch light. "Yeah, maybe," he said, his voice softer now. "But I think I'll miss other things more." The way he said it made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something told me not to. Instead, I smiled, giving his arm a light nudge. "Come on, you'll forget all about this place when you're drowning in homework and frat parties." He smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll see." As the night deepened, the tension I'd felt earlier didn't fade. If anything, it grew heavier, pressing against my chest in a way I couldn't explain. I stayed outside long after Ryan went back inside, watching the stars and wondering why the quiet felt so loud. Later that night, I was still sitting on the porch, lost in thought, when I heard the creak of the screen door behind me. Ryan stepped out again, this time carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to me without a word, and then settled into the chair next to mine. The silence between us was comfortable at first, just the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You didn't have to bring me anything," I said, breaking the quiet. He shrugged, his bare foot idly tapping against the porch railing. I figured you'd still be out here. You looked deep in thought earlier. I raised an eyebrow. And since when are you so observant? He chuckled softly, his lips curving into the kind of smile that reminded me how much he'd grown. Since always, you just never noticed. I smiled back, though his answer caught me off guard. He wasn't wrong. Ryan had always been quiet, watching more than speaking. But lately there was a maturity in him that I wasn't used to. It made me feel both proud and strangely uncertain, like I was seeing him for the first time. We sat like that for a while, sipping our drinks and watching the moon rise higher into the sky. The conversation started light, how the garden was doing, his upcoming trip to visit a college he was considering, and the stray cat that had been hanging around the neighborhood. But as the minutes passed, the small talk gave way to something deeper, like a tide rolling in slowly but steadily. You ever feel like you're just stuck? He asked after a long pause. I turned to look at him, but his gaze was fixed on the street beyond our driveway, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shaking his head like he was trying to find the right words. It's just, everyone talks about how college is supposed to be the best years of your life, right? But what if it's not? What if I screw it up or don't fit in? Ryan, I said gently, everyone feels that way before a big change. You're not supposed to have all the answers right now. He glanced at me, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my chest tighten. Yeah, but what if I don't figure it out? What if I end up like Dad? The mention of his father hit like a crack in the quiet. I took a deep breath, setting my glass down on the porch. You're not your dad, Ryan. You've got so much going for you, and you're not doing this alone. I'm here, okay? Whatever you need, I'll be here. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. For a moment, I thought about reaching over to take his hand, but I stopped myself. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, letting the breeze cool my face. You're overthinking it, I said after a moment. College isn't about having everything figured out. It's about finding your way, making mistakes, and learning from them. You'll be fine. Ryan didn't say anything right away, but when he finally looked at me, his expression softened. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, I admitted with a small laugh, but it's worth it. And if anyone can handle it, you can. His lips twitched into a faint smile. Thanks, he said quietly. The conversation drifted into lighter territory after that, and we spent the next hour talking about his favorite memories from when he was younger. Camping trips, baseball games, the time he got stuck in a tree, and his dad had to call the fire department to get him down. It felt good to see him laugh, even if it was just for a little while. By the time he stood up to head back inside, the tension I'd felt earlier had lessened, replaced by something softer, more fragile. Good night, Emily, he said, his voice low and warm as he lingered by the door. Good night, Ryan, I replied, watching him disappear into the house. For a while, I stayed on the porch, staring at the spot where he'd been sitting. There was something about the way he'd looked at me tonight, something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. It left me feeling unmoored, as though the ground beneath me had shifted just enough to throw me off balance. The next morning started off slow and lazy, the kind of Saturday where nothing felt urgent. I woke up late, made myself some coffee, and decided it was a stay-in-your-robe until noon kind of day. The sunlight poured through the windows, warming the living room as I flipped through an old magazine, the sound of the TV humming softly in the background. Ryan was still asleep, or so I thought. The house was quiet, giving me a rare moment to savor the calm. I stretched out on the couch, letting my robe fall loosely over my legs. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the rare stillness. And then I heard his voice. Morning. I froze, my eyes darting toward the doorway. Ryan stood there, his hair tousled from sleep, wearing a simple t-shirt and pajama bottoms. His gaze landed on me and lingered. Ryan! I yelped, instinctively grabbing the edge of my robe and pulling it tighter. Sorry, he blurted, immediately turning away. I didn't know you were... I didn't see anything. The flush on his cheeks betrayed him, and for a moment, neither of us moved. My heart was pounding, a mix of embarrassment and something else I couldn't quite place. "It's fine," I said quickly, sitting up and adjusting myself. "I just wasn't expecting anyone to be up yet." He nodded, his back still to me. "Yeah, I woke up early. Didn't mean to—" "Ryan, it's okay," I interrupted, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "You didn't do anything wrong?" He glanced over his shoulder, his expression somewhere between sheepish and uncertain. "I'll just grab some breakfast." And with that, he disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the living room, my skin still prickling with heat. I let out a long breath, leaning back against the couch. It was an accident. Just an awkward moment, nothing more. At least that's what I told myself. But for the rest of the morning, the house felt different. Ryan avoided looking directly at me, and every time we crossed paths, me in the kitchen, him on his way to the laundry room, there was a strange energy between us. A charged silence that neither of us acknowledged but couldn't seem to escape. Later, as I folded laundry in my room, I caught myself replaying the moment in my mind. The way his eyes had briefly widened, the way he'd stammered and turned away so quickly. It was nothing. Just a boy startled by an awkward situation. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the embarrassment that lingered, but an awareness, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither of us knew how to address. I sighed, shaking my head and tossing a towel into the laundry basket. "Get a grip, Emily," I muttered under my breath, but no matter how much I tried to brush it off, the moment hung in the air, refusing to be forgotten. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into its familiar evening stillness, I decided it was time to break through the heavy, unspoken air that had been hanging between us since that morning. The day had passed in a blur of avoidance. Ryan had spent most of it in his room, and I had busied myself with chores that didn't really need doing. But now, as I stood in the kitchen, rinsing the last of the dinner plates, I realized I couldn't let the tension linger another night. I glanced toward the living room, where Ryan was scrolling on his phone, his long legs stretched out over the edge of the couch. He looked relaxed, but there was a stiffness in his posture, like he was trying too hard to appear casual. "How about a movie tonight?" I said, drying my hands on a dish towel. "We haven't done that in a while." He looked up, his brows lifting slightly in surprise. "A movie?" "Yeah, something fun," I said, keeping my tone light. "No drama, no thinking. Just something we can laugh at. What do you say?" For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, his lips pressing into a thin line like he was debating whether to agree. Then he nodded. "Sure, sounds good." I smiled, relieved, and gestured toward the couch. "You pick, I'll grab the popcorn." A few minutes later, I joined him on the couch with a freshly popped bowl in hand. Ryan had settled on a classic comedy, one we'd watched a few times before. Light, harmless, familiar. It was exactly what I needed. As the movie started, I leaned back, tucking one leg beneath me, and placed the bowl between us. The couch felt bigger than usual, the space between us suddenly significant in a way it hadn't been before. I focused on the screen, determined to keep things as normal as possible, but I was acutely aware of him. Every time he shifted, every little movement, I noticed. The first half of the movie passed easily enough. We laughed at the same jokes, made a few quiet comments about scenes we'd forgotten. For a little while, it almost felt like the tension had dissolved. But then, as the movie slowed into one of its quieter moments, something shifted. We both reached for the popcorn at the same time. Our hands brushed. Just a fleeting touch, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. "Oops," I said quickly, pulling my hand back with a laugh that sounded too high-pitched to my own ears. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at him, and the look on his face stopped me cold. He wasn't laughing. His eyes, a darker shade than usual in the dim light, were locked on mine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. It was like the room had shrunk, like the space between us had vanished entirely. I broke the gaze first, turning back to the screen as my heart thudded in my chest. What the hell was that? The rest of the movie passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on the story, couldn't hear the jokes over the pounding of my pulse. I was too aware of him, the way his arm rested along the back of the couch, so close that I could feel the faintest brush of his sleeve against my shoulder. The way he shifted slightly toward me, his body angled just enough to make it impossible to ignore his presence. When the credits finally rolled, I shot up from the couch, grabbing the empty popcorn bowl. "I'll take care of this," I said, my voice a little too bright, a little too rushed. "You don't have to," Ryan said, standing as well. "I don't mind," I replied quickly, already heading to the kitchen. As I rinsed the bowl in the sink, I stared down at the water, watching it swirl and drain. My hands shook slightly as I placed the bowl on the drying rack. What was happening? Why couldn't I shake this feeling? "Good night," Ryan said softly from the doorway, startling me. I turned, plastering on a smile. "Good night, Ryan." He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared down the hall. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, leaning against the counter and listening to the quiet hum of the house. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away. That brush of his hand, the look in his eyes, it wasn't just in my head. Something had shifted between us, something unspoken but undeniably real. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to pretend that everything was still the same, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would be the same again. I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of midnight, but my thoughts were anything but calm. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from earlier that evening. The laughter, the tension, the accidental touch of our hands. It was all tangled up in my mind, making it impossible to find peace. Finally, I gave up on the idea of sleep. Throwing on a cardigan over my pajamas, I padded softly down the hallway and slipped out the back door into the cool night air. The yard stretched out before me, bathed in the soft silver light of the moon. The stars were scattered across the sky like shards of glass, sharp and beautiful. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, hoping it might help clear my head. But I wasn't alone. Ryan was already there, sitting on the weathered wooden bench at the edge of the yard. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched slightly, his head tilted upward as he stared at the sky. I hesitated, my hand on the doorframe, debating whether I should interrupt him, but then he turned, noticing me before I could slip away. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked softly, his voice low and even. I shook my head and stepped closer, the grass cool beneath my bare feet. "Number you?" "Not really," he admitted, scooting over to make room on the bench. "I've been out here for a while." I sat down beside him, careful to leave enough space between us to feel appropriate. But even with the gap, his presence felt too close, too immediate. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just sat there staring up at the stars, listening to the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a peaceful kind of silence, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "Do you ever feel lost?" Ryan finally asked, breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the ground now. "I don't know, just like you don't really know who you are or where you're going. Like everyone else seems to have it all figured out, and you're just stuck." The vulnerability in his voice tugged at something deep inside me. This wasn't the confident, easygoing Ryan I usually saw. This was a side of him he rarely showed. Raw, uncertain, searching for something he couldn't quite name. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes, especially when you're trying to figure out your next steps. It's scary." He nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know what I'm doing. College is coming up, and I feel like I'm supposed to have everything figured out by now. Like I'm supposed to know what I want, who I want to be. But I don't." "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I said gently. "You're allowed to take your time, to figure it out as you go. There's no deadline for finding yourself." He glanced at me then, his eyes searching mine. "It's just hard, you know? Especially without Dad around. He was supposed to be the one helping me with all of this, and now it's just me." The mention of his father made my chest ache. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Ryan. I know I'm not him, and I can't be him, but I'm here. I'll always be here. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, to my surprise, he leaned into me, resting his head on my shoulder like he used to when he was younger. It caught me off guard, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I wrapped an arm around him, holding him close as the night stretched on around us. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. I felt a lump rise in my throat, the weight of his words pressing heavily against me. "You'll never have to find out," I whispered, my own voice trembling slightly. The moment lingered, stretching longer than it should have. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body against mine. And then he lifted his head, turning to look at me. His face was so close, his expression so open and unguarded, that it made my heart stutter. I saw it then, the shift. The unspoken thing that had been building between us, hovering just out of reach, was now staring me in the face. I couldn't deny it anymore, couldn't pretend it wasn't there, but I didn't know what to do with it. So, I stayed silent, holding his gaze for a moment too long before I finally looked away. "We should go inside," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Ryan hesitated, but then he nodded, standing up and offering me his hand. I took it, and we walked back to the house together, the silence between us heavier than ever. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, about the way it had made me feel, something I couldn't name, something I wasn't ready to face. But deep down, I knew. Something had changed, and there was no going back. The heat of the late afternoon sun was relentless, even as it began its slow descent toward the horizon. I stood by the fence at the edge of the yard, crouched down as I worked to secure a loose plank with a hammer. Sweat clung to my skin, and my hair stuck to the back of my neck. I had told myself that this small project would help distract me from the restless thoughts that had plagued me for days. But even here, in the middle of something so mundane, Ryan found a way to occupy my mind. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Turning slightly, I caught sight of him walking toward me, a water bottle in one hand and a determined expression on his face. His t-shirt clung to his chest from the humidity, and his dark hair was damp at the edges. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice light but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I straightened up, brushing stray strands of hair out of my face. "I've got it, but if you're offering..." Ryan handed me the water bottle first, and I accepted it gratefully, taking a long sip. He set himself up beside me, grabbing the extra hammer and crouching down to inspect the fence. "Looks like this whole section is going to need replacing soon," he said, his tone casual. I nodded, trying to keep my focus on the task at hand. "Yeah, I've been putting it off, hoping it'd hold out a little longer. Guess I can't ignore it anymore." We worked side by side for a while, falling into an easy rhythm. He held the planks in place while I hammered, and our conversation stayed light. Banter about the fence, jokes about the yard, complaints about the heat. But beneath it all, there was a tension I couldn't ignore, an awareness of him that made every small movement feel magnified. At one point, as I leaned forward to drive in a nail, our hands brushed. Just a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye and saw that he had frozen, his hand hovering where mine had been. "Sorry," he said softly, but he didn't move. "It's okay," I replied, though my voice sounded far too shaky for my liking. The moment stretched out, the silence between us growing heavier by the second. I felt the weight of his gaze on me, and when I finally turned to look at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart skip. A mixture of hesitation, longing, and something else I didn't want to name. "Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of how close we were. "We should finish up before it gets dark," I said quickly, my words tumbling out in a rush. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine again, this time intentionally. His touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver through me. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something. Not anymore. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating all at once. I wanted to say something, to put up a wall between us, to create a boundary that couldn't be crossed. But the words wouldn't come. "Ryan," I started, but my voice faltered. He stepped back then, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything." He turned to leave, and for a brief, panicked moment, I wanted to call him back. To tell him, what? That I felt it too? That I didn't know what to do with these emotions any more than he did? But I stayed silent, watching him walk away toward the house, his shoulders tense, his head down. The quiet of the yard pressed in around me as I stood there, my hammer still in hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked at the fence, at the unfinished plank, and realized that I didn't care about it anymore. What I cared about was the boy, no, the man, who had just walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of a mess far bigger than any broken fence. The house was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem louder than it should. I was in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes after dinner. The rhythmic clinking of plates and the soft hum of the faucet were the only sounds keeping my thoughts at bay. Ryan had barely said a word throughout the meal, his usual chatter replaced by a heavy, noticeable silence. I didn't have to turn around to know he was there. I heard the faint creak of the floorboards behind me, felt the shift in the air as he stepped closer. "Emily," he said softly, his voice tentative but resolute. I dried my hands on a dish towel, taking a moment to compose myself before turning around. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Ryan?" I asked, my voice calm despite the nervous energy building in my chest. He hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then took a step closer. "I need to say something," he began, his eyes locking onto mine. "And I know it's probably the worst idea I've ever had, but I can't keep this to myself anymore." I stayed silent, my heart pounding as he spoke. "I feel something for you," he said, the words rushing out in a breathless tumble. "Something I know I shouldn't feel. And I know you're my stepmom, and it's not normal, but I can't help it. I've been trying to push it away, but it's only gotten stronger." His confession hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I had expected this, hadn't I? The lingering glances, the tension in our conversations, the charged silences. It had all been building to this. "Ryan," I finally said, my voice low and steady, though I felt anything but calm. "You don't need to apologize, but this is complicated." He laughed softly, a bitter edge to the sound. "Complicated doesn't even begin to cover it." I took a step closer, closing the distance between us. "You're young," I said gently, trying to find the right words. "These feelings, they're natural, but it doesn't mean we can act on them." He shook his head, his expression frustrated. "This isn't some stupid crush, Emily. I know what I feel, and I know it's real." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. He was standing so close now, his presence overwhelming, and I could see the raw emotion in his eyes, the vulnerability, the longing, the fear of rejection. "Ryan, you're important to me," I said softly, my voice almost breaking. "But this, what you're feeling, it's not something we can pursue. There are boundaries we can't cross." He looked away then, his jaw tightening. "I knew you'd say that," he muttered. But I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. I needed you to know. The silence stretched between us, heavy and filled with unspoken emotions. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to say something that would ease the pain etched across his face. But I didn't trust myself. "Ryan," I said gently, taking a step back to create some distance. "You're brave for telling me how you feel, but we need to take a step back for both our sakes." He nodded slowly, though his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry if I made things weird," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had to tell you." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. I leaned against the counter, letting out a shaky breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever this was between us, it had crossed a line, and there was no going back to the way things had been. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt both peaceful and suffocating. I sat at the dining table with a mug of coffee staring out at the backyard. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the grass. Ryan hadn't come downstairs yet, and the house felt heavier than usual, like it was holding its breath. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. He walked into the kitchen, his hair still messy from sleep, his expression cautious. Neither of us spoke as he poured himself a glass of orange juice and sat down across from me. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything left unsaid. I didn't know how to start this conversation, how to address the confession that had shifted everything between us, but I knew we couldn't avoid it forever. "Ryan," I began, my voice soft but steady, "we need to talk." He nodded, setting his glass down and meeting my gaze. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking about it all night." "So have I admitted, taking a deep breath. "What you said yesterday, it's not something we can ignore, but we need to figure out how to move forward, how to handle this." He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "I don't regret telling you," he said after a moment, "but I get it. I know it's complicated. He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't want to lose what we have, even if it's not what I hoped it could be." His honesty struck a chord in me, and I felt a pang of guilt for the boundaries I knew I had to enforce. But beneath that guilt was something else, a warmth, a connection I couldn't deny. "You're not going to lose me," I said firmly. "But we need to be careful, Ryan. What you're feeling, it's real, I know that. But it's also something we have to navigate with a lot of care." He nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said. I don't know how to turn these feelings off." I smiled sadly, reaching across the table to place my hand over his. "You don't have to. Feelings aren't something we can control, but we can control how we act on them, and right now we need to focus on what's best for both of us." The warmth of his hand under mine was a reminder of how close we had grown, how easily we had fallen into this uncharted territory. But I knew this moment was crucial, a chance to set the tone for whatever came next. "We'll figure it out," I said softly, my voice filled with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Together." He smiled then, a small, hesitant smile that made him look younger than his 18 years. "Okay," he said, "together." The weight between us lifted slightly, replaced by a tentative sense of understanding. We didn't have all the answers, but we had reached a fragile truce, a commitment to handle this new dynamic with honesty and care. As the day unfolded, the tension in the house began to ease. We fell into our usual routines, but there was a newfound openness in our interactions. Ryan didn't avoid me like he had in the past, and I felt more at ease addressing the subtle shifts in our relationship. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat on the porch together, much like we had on that first summer night. The air was warm, the cicadas humming softly in the background. Ryan glanced at me, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked, tilting my head to look at him. "For not pushing me away," he said simply. I didn't respond right away, letting his words settle over me. "I care about you, Ryan," I said finally, "and no matter what happens, that's not going to change." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, not for what we might become, but for the trust and understanding we had built.